Steve is one of the presenters at HASP that most intensely conveys the joy of learning, the joy of research, the joy of going to primary sources, the adventure of it all, and sometimes the dangers of it all. So welcome back, Steve.
Thank you, Judy. I really appreciate that. And it is a real joy to be here with you. The other evening, I wrote Amy a note just to express again how much I enjoy being in the HASP classroom. Judy's correct. I love teaching and sharing what I'm learning with other people. So thank you again, Judy, for that introduction and for welcoming here again. One other thing I mentioned to Amy is how much I enjoy that HASP members and the conversation I have with you. It's really enlightening for me. And I've found this to be a really supportive environment. So I'm really grateful for that. I'm also grateful to be here. I didn't think I'd make it on time. The highway went down to one lane. I live in Grand Rapids. I wasn't sure I was going to make it on time because the traffic was stopped. And then of course, I hit a train when I got to Holland. Oh no, I'm not going to make it. So thanks. It's good to be here. As Judy mentioned, this course is exploring the role of race and religion in the early modern Dutch Atlantic world. God and Mammon as the working title of this project. And to begin, I'd like to once again highlight the object or purpose of this course, why I thought it might be useful to explore this, and why really I thought it was useful to explore this subject. And that is to explore how ideologies of race influence the ways in which early modern Calvinists of both African, and we're going to meet one today, and European descent interpreted their Bibles, organized institutions, and participated in the broader societies of the Dutch Atlantic world. You may recall that in the last session, I analyzed the ways in which Willem Bosman, a Calvinist merchant in the service of the West India Company, shifted the concept of race from one based on religious criteria to one based on biological criteria in 1704 with the publication of his now keurige beschrijving, his accurate description. In this session, I will show how Jacobus Elias Johannes Kapitein, the first person of African descent, ordained as a minister in an orthodox Protestant denomination. How Jacobus Kapitein challenged the enslavement of Africans 38 years after Bosman published his accurate description of the Ghanaian gold, ivory, and slave coast. Now, before I begin, I'll just let you know that notion, that idea, that thesis that I'm going to present to you today challenges how he's often perceived, Jacobus Kapitein. I also at this point should also note, much to my chagrin, because of time constraints, I had to take out quite a bit of the intellectual context from the presentation. Otherwise, we wouldn't get there. And I'm also afraid that I might not get into a lot of the analysis of Kapitein's dissertation that I wanted to present as well. In other words, a lot of the intellectual history has been taken out. I had to sacrifice something, which means, Lord willing, if it ever gets published, you can read further more about that. Now, regrettably, we do not know Capitine's birth name because he was probably not allowed to use it. We do know that he was born somewhere in the vicinity of the Gold Coast. And you can see on this historic map the location of the Gold Coast, according to this English geographer. We do know Capitine was born somewhere in the vicinity of the Gold Coast, sometime between 1716 and 1718. 1716 to 1718. We do know he was born in those years somewhere in the vicinity of the Gold Coast. Now, as you know, I think context is important. All historians do. That's why we do history. It provides us context. I like to say to my history students, if real estate is all about location, 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 history is all about context, context, context. How can you understand your present without context? And that's what history provides us. Context, we need it to understand more fully. Now, 1716, 1718, when Capitine was born, that was a chaotic time along the coast of West Africa, as I'm about to share with you. European competition over the Atlantic slave trade had created a culture of competition that made it inefficient and financially precarious. All that competition among European slave trading companies made it inefficient and financially precarious for those trading companies. Around 1 in 3 slave ships were seized by pirates. 1 in 3. On top of that, illness, revolts, and insurrections could erase a company's profit margin for an entire year. So illness among the Africans on board your ship, they're revolting against being enslaved, and their insurrections could erase a slave trading company's profit margin for an entire year. And then you add this: wars of conquest by the emerging kingdoms of Asante and Dahomey generated large numbers of refugees and captives who were marched to the coast. So the kingdom, as you see on the map, the Asante kingdom is expanding, as is the Dahomey kingdom. And in their wars, those wars generate refugees and captives, and they end up being marched down to the coast. And you probably would have guessed that attracted even more human traffickers from Europe who introduced additional violence on the coast. So Capitine is born into a very chaotic time in West Africa. And those competitive conditions created the kind of environment in which piracy thrived. It was good for pirates. Between 1719 and 1722, the Welsh captain Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts and his pirates took over 400 ships off the coast of the Americas and the West African coast. In those 3 years, over 400 ships Black Bart and his pirates took off the coast of the Americas and West Africa. If you're a slave ship captain, you're afraid of those attacks. Black Bart and his crew looted, damaged, and stole or burned their ships, and then either freed, murdered, sold, or coerced the enslaved on board those ships into piracy. Many of the slaves enslaved didn't need much persuading. until a fleet of more than 200 pirates brazenly followed Black Bart's flagship into Owita Harbor in January 1722. Black Bart's pirates had evaded the British and Dutch navies. A month later, February 1722, two British men of war finally tracked down the pirates at Cape Lopez, a headland on the coast of present-day Gabon. When the news of the defeat of Black Bart's pirates at Cape Lopez reached Europe, the shareholders of the major slave trading companies rejoiced. Yes. British enslavers who returned to the coast of West Africa after the Battle of Cape Lopez discovered that the slave trade was profitable beyond their wildest dreams, now that Black Bart's been removed and his pirates. New investors looking to make a fortune flocked to the slave trade. Fearing they would be cut out of the slave trade, the Dutch teamed up with the British to take a second stab at destroying the largest, most obvious threat to the Dutch West India Company's trade. The Gold Coast King, known as John Canoy. John Canoy was the leader of the Hahante, an Akan ethnic group, and Coney entertained anyone willing to trade at Fort Great Fredericksburg. Coney's sizable army and extensive experience dealing with slave traders gave Coney the upper hand. Coney successfully poached West India Company customers and encouraged their competitors. So the Dutch teamed up with the English to take him down. With the defeat of Black Bart and John Coney, few obstacles remained to the slave trade in West Africa. The number of enslaved Africans hauled from the continent increased from around 40,000 in 1720 to 60,000 after 1724. By the way, by 1760, it's going to be 90,000. These numbers were just the start of the exponential increase in the enslavement and transshipment of millions of humans across the Atlantic. And so, the Battle of Cape Lopez and the defeat of John Coney represents the time when the transatlantic slave trade took off and facilitated the expansion of chattel slavery in the Americas. Caught up in this inhuman traffic at this very moment, that's why I mentioned this context, was an 8-year-old boy. Although neither the names of his parents or the place or date of his birth are known, it is likely that a leader from a rival interior tribe ordered a raid on the boy's village to supply the slave trade along the Gold Coast. It is also probable that the boy, like John Coney, was a member of the Akan people, a diverse ethno-linguistic group that includes the Ahanta, the Asante, the Akyem, Akwapim, the Brong and Fanti, among others. So you can see many of the Akan peoples labeled on this map. Very diverse ethno-linguistic group. After the 8-year-old boy was kidnapped from his village, he was brought to a trade center on the St. Andrews River, where he was bought by Arnold Steinhardt, a Dutch enslaver and sea captain employed by the Dutch West India Company. Prior to his arrival on the St. Andrews River, Steinhardt captained a ship filled with 564 Africans across the Atlantic. During the passage, 154 of the Africans died. Having completed his human purchases at the trade center on the St. Andrews River, Admiral Steinhardt brought the 8-year-old boy with the rest of his African captives to this fortress, the Dutch fortress at Elmina. As you can see by the Dutch at the top, this is a Dutch illustration of that fortress. You can see the Dutch flag flying over the fortress. When he arrived in Elmina, Steinhardt gave the boy as a gift to his friend, Captain Jacobus van Gogh, a West India Company merchant who had worked on the Gold Coast for 15 years. The boy would serve van Gogh during his last 2 years working as an enslaver at Elmina. This is a modern photograph of Elmina, the castle. Elmina, by the way, there's a village there too. That's Elmina's the castle, but there's also Elmina, the village nearby. Now, Elmina, the village, lies along the Benya River on the Guinea coast in present-day Ghana. So if you want to go visit Elmina and go to this castle, you take a flight to Ghana. Elmina lies along the Benya River on the Guinea coast in present-day Ghana. Elmina is a part of Akan territory. And at the time, Elmina was a flourishing commercial town. And it had been a flourishing salt mining center until the early 16th century, 1500s. After the Dutch wrestled control of Castillo São Jorge da Mina, a little Portuguese there for you this morning. St. George of the Mine Castle translation, Castillo São Jorge da Mina, St. George of the Mine Castle. What mine? Salt mines were nearby, so the Portuguese noted, oh, this is a salt mining center, St. George of the Mine Castle. The Dutch West India Company wrestled that fort from the Portuguese in 1637. And that castle became the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company on the west coast of Africa. That's the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch had many forts along the West African coast. This was the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company on the Guinea coast. It is from here enslaved Africans and goods from other Dutch forts along the West African coast were collected before being shipped across the Atlantic to the Dutch Republic or the Americas. So again, the headquarters. Goods and enslaved people were sent here from the other parts of the Dutch, what the Dutch viewed as the Dutch Guinea coast, to here from the other Dutch forts. So they're collected here before being shipped across the Atlantic. Now, upon their arrival, and these again are modern photographs, upon their arrival at Elmina Castle, as you can see from the slide, the Dutch separated the enslaved by gender. The women and girls were imprisoned in a small outdoor courtyard. Below the chambers, this is important, so it's an outdoor courtyard below the chambers of the Director General and Chief Merchant of the West India Company on the Guinea coast. So the number one in charge, the Director General of the Dutch West India Company on that coast, had his rooms, his chambers, overlooking that courtyard, as did the Chief Merchant. That's the number two, the Opperkoopman, the number two on the coast of the Dutch West India Company. As you can see from the picture down below right, the balls around which their feet were shackled lie there to this day, as you can see. From their rooms overlooking this small courtyard, the Director General and chief merchants like Willem Bosman, remember Willem was a chief merchant, his room was above that courtyard when he was there, Willem. From their rooms overlooking that courtyard, the Director General and chief merchants like Willem Bosman selected women and young girls who caught their eye and ordered the women and young girls be taken to their bedrooms upstairs through a separate entrance. Traders would also routinely grab the breasts, buttocks, and vaginal areas of women and young girls to allegedly assess their child rearing ability. We call that assault. As one white trafficker testified, this process was like what he would do with a horse if he was about to buy it. When a West India Company ship was ready to set sail across the Atlantic, the enslaved, who had been branded with scorching hot irons, were assigned a number prior to loading. Separated by gender once again, the enslaved were tightly packed into the holds under extreme and lethal conditions. Although the Dutch, you remember, said, well, our conditions were more humane and clean. By the way, this is what's now today known as the gate of no return, where the enslaved would go through that and then walk down to the ship before being loaded. Men and boys were typically locked spoonways, naked and forced to lie in blood, feces, mucus, and urine with little to no fresh air. It was, as one white surgeon who participated in the human trade testified, quote, impossible for them to turn or shift with any degree or ease, end quote. Women and girls suffered horrific conditions in the holds as well. Forced to be naked, they faced the constant fear of being assaulted or raped by white sailors. As that same white surgeon testified in court, the sexual assault of young girls and women was so commonplace that sailors were, and now to quote him from the court record, permitted to indulge their passions among them at their pleasure, end quote. Although this inhuman trade had become more important than anything else by the time the 8-year-old boy was gifted to the West India Company merchant Jacobus van Gogh, it would prove to be the greatest stumbling block to Kapitein's evangelistic enterprise when he returned to Elmina 14 years later in 1742. On April 14, 1728, Jacobus van Gogh left Elmina for the Dutch Republic and took the 8-year-old he claimed as property with him. by that time, the 8-year-old, I used 8-year-old, he would have been 10 by that time. I used 8 just to remind us that we're talking about Kapitän. However, the moment the boy, the 10-year-old, stepped off the boat in Middelburg, Zeeland, which you see here, there's an illustration, bird's eye view of Middelburg. The moment the boy stepped off the boat, off the ship, he immediately gained his freedom. Once he stepped onto Dutch Republic soil, he was freed. He was no longer enslaved. Why was that? That was because slavery had been outlawed in the Dutch Republic in 1648. In 1648, the Dutch had signed the Treaty of Münster, the Peace of Münster, which ended the war with Spain. And part of the deal was slavery was outlawed in the Dutch Republic. From Middelburg, Van Gogh took the boy to his home in The Hague. And here's a view of the Binnenhof in The Hague. Although The Hague was not as cosmopolitan as Amsterdam, the Binnenhof, the historic complex of buildings where the States General meets to this day. The States General is the Dutch Parliament. It meets in the Binnenhof. The Binnenhof served as a reminder of the ideals of the Dutch Republic. What were those ideals? What did the Dutch Republic hold up as its values? It held up economic freedom was a value. 2, individual liberty, value number 2. Value 3, religious tolerance. And finally, a strong sense of self-governance. Values, by the way, which influenced some of the founders of the United States of America. Yet the economic and commercial prosperity enjoyed in the Dutch Republic was based in part on Dutch participation in the transatlantic slave trade. And that participation made some in the Dutch Republic uncomfortable. In fact, the Dutch entered the slave trade initially with a tangible degree of hesitation that can be linked to domestic debates about its legitimacy. Prior to 1621, the members of the West India Company debated whether to engage in the slave trade, even soliciting opinions from Calvinist theologians on the issue. Which should not surprise us. Most of the founders of the Dutch West India Company were Calvinists and members of the Dutch Reformed Church. So if they're debating it, well, let's ask the theologians. They're the educated people in our society. Well, how about those Calvinist theologians? Well, for their part, they spent a good part of 1619 gathered in the Synod of Dordrecht, debating the subject of predestination, as well, many don't know, the issue of slavery. It was debated at the Synod. In the end, you may be wondering, what did they decide? In the end, the gathered Calvinist theologians, neither, doesn't this sound very Calvinist? Neither universally condemned nor legitimized slavery. Rather, they left the acceptability of slavery up to individual citizens. Although there was no abolitionist movement on the same scale as in England, and there was minimal public debate over the abolition of slavery in the Dutch Republic, the Synod's compromise on slavery does reflect something, doesn't it? It reflects the presence of anti-slavery sentiment in the Dutch Republic. That sentiment existed. And that anti-slavery sentiment was generated by three primary factors. I'm going to use a painting to illustrate these. This is a painting of Philip II on the right, King of Spain, who's reproaching Willem I, the Prince of Orange, in Vlissingen upon his departure from the Dutch Republic in 1559. So here we have a prince or a nobleman, a lord on the left, Willem, often known as Willem the Silent, who was one of the leaders of the Dutch revolt. He's about to depart the Dutch Republic, and the King of Spain is there in front of him, dressing him down, so to speak, reproaching him for leading a revolt against the Spanish Habsburgs. So anti-slavery sentiment was generated in the Dutch Republic by three factors, three primary factors. First, the concept of vrijheid, freedom, carried considerable weight in the Dutch Republic, both during and after the struggle for independence from the Spanish crown. Independence from a crown. That sounds similar to what Americans are saying about the King of England. Independence from a crown. Vrijheid, freedom. This painting illustrates it, does it not? Here is our leader of the revolt being reproached by the king, right? And having to leave his homeland. Vrijheid, freedom, right? That's a very patriotic painting for the Dutch. Vrijheid, freedom. By the way, the Dutch national anthem, the Wilhelmus, one of the oldest national anthems in the world, the King of Spain's mentioned in the opening verse, right? We honored you. We will to all tide. We will honor you, yet we are of Duitse bloed, Dutch blood, right? And you were oppressive. You didn't give us our vrijheid, our freedom. So we rightfully revolted. It was a righteous revolt. Second factor, Dutch society was characterized by a strong philanthropic streak. A lot of that wealth generated by the transatlantic slave trade, many of those who generated great generational wealth used that to found orphan houses, for example, throughout the Dutch Republic. Third, the third primary factor influencing that anti-slavery sentiment, the theology of Dutch Calvinism promoted abolition and missionary work amongst Africans. So that too led some towards an anti-slavery position. However, the lure of mammon was irresistible to most members of the Dutch Reformed Church and the West India Company. And it was the temptation of profits and power that resulted in Kapitein's enslavement and arrival in The Hague on April 1, 1726. At first, I'm going to talk a little, what was Kapitein's experience like being a 10-year-old African in The Hague? At first, Kapitein, not surprisingly, felt isolated. He writes about it. He felt isolated in The Hague because he could not speak the language, and there were no other Africans in the city. Now, if you go to Amsterdam, there were other Africans, but in The Hague, as far as we know from the records, there were no other Africans in The Hague. After a couple of years, Kapitein learned enough Dutch. So around the age of 12, he had learned enough Dutch to join Reverend Johann Philip Manger's catechetical school in the Grote Kerk, as you see on the slide. There's the Grote Kerk, one of the oldest buildings in The Hague, Den Haag. Kapitein spent 4 years, around the ages of 12 to 16, spent 4 years under the tutelage of Reverend Johann Manger, who Kapitein described as a, quote, man of noble character, sound knowledge, and remarkable devotion to God, end quote. In Manger's classes, Kapitein learned to read and write Dutch. He also learned arithmetic, customary prayers, and most importantly to Reverend Manger, the Heidelberg Catechism, which, by the way, when I was little growing up at the church I memorized the Heidelberg Catechism. You had to do that before you could make profession of faith. No easy task, might I say. When Manger's colleague, Reverend Hendrik Velse, you see Velse here on the slide, when Manger's colleague, Reverend Hendrik Velse, learned that Kapitein wanted to study theology so that he could return home and evangelize among his sisters and brothers in West Africa, Velse approached his parishioner, Jacobus von Koch, Kapitein's adoptive father. Pastor of the Reformed congregation in Den Haag, Reverend Velse was a fierce advocate of conducting missionary work among the Gentiles overseas, particularly in West Africa. Velse urged von Koch to send Kapitein to the Hague Latin School on the condition that he would later devote his life to missionary work in West Africa. As an added incentive, Velse offered to contribute to Kapitein's education. Von Koch agreed and sent Kapitein to the Latin school, where he would spend the next 6 years. To help him excel in school, Velse introduced Kapitein to Francina Katharina Roskam, an educated noblewoman. Roskam opened her house to teach young students. This is impressive. Listen, to teach young students, Roskam opened her house to teach students Chaldean, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Roskam taught young students enrolled in the Latin school those languages: Chaldean, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Obviously, bedrock languages to learn if you want to read the original of the Bible, sources for the Bible. If you're going to study theology, you need to know those languages. In school, so that's where he learned it from Roskam. And I found, this is gorgeous. This is a poem in praise of Francina Roskam by a rabbi in Leeuwarden in the province of Friesland. And you can see the Hebrew, and it's a poem praising her for her virtue and her education. She's an academic, right? Working out of her home, right? Obviously, was not allowed to be a professor in a school, but opened up her home to share her knowledge of all these languages she knew. In school, in the Latin school, Kapitein studied then the New Testament in Greek, thanks to Roskam, thank you, translated Cicero and Ovid into Dutch, and memorized the Heidelberg Catechism in Dutch. He also learned the fundamentals of rhetoric, logic, oratory, and writing. Kapitein, you see, is becoming an academic. During his 4th year at the Latin school, remember Reverend Manger, his catechetical teacher, Manger baptized Kapitein in the Kloosterkerk in Den Haag on July 8, 1735. During his baptism, Capitein formally received the name Jacobus after his guardian, Jacobus von Hock, his adoptive father. He received the name Elisa after one of von Hock's sisters. And he received the name Johannes after one of von Hock's nieces. Jacobus, Elisa, Johannes, Capitein. 2 years after his baptism in the Dutch Reformed Church, the Kloosterkerk, Capitein concluded his years at the Latin school by preparing and presenting a public address. Now, for me, the research into this was crucial to understand his dissertation and why I argue he's challenging enslavement, even though most historians and contemporaries read him as supporting enslavement. I argue, no, that's not what he's doing. He's challenging it. I hope to prove that this morning. And this is, to me, key to understand his views. 2 years after his baptism in the Dutch Reformed faith, Capitein concluded his years at the Latin school by preparing and presenting a public address, much like this. This address would be the first, I argue, this would be the first of Johannes Elisa Johannes Capitein's missionary initiatives and challenges to enslavement. Capitein entitled his public address, Roeping der Heidenen. Now, most have translated that call of the heathens. I translated call of the Gentiles. And if you want to know why, you need to read my first book, first chapter, and what I discovered about the word Heidenen. Call of the Gentiles. In his public address, he made two primary arguments. First, he had to take up this curse of Ham theory, because that was the vogue of the day to justify slavery. So first, by the way, this is a detail of a tapestry woven in Brussels in 1550 of Noah's inebriety, a detail of a larger tapestry. First, Capitein argued that the curse of Ham, which had been used by many in the Dutch Republic to justify the enslavement of Black people, was not intended to last forever. Second, Capitein argued that God promised that the descendants of Ham and Japheth would become his children too. I'm his child too. The fact that these are the central arguments of the call of the Gentiles reflected that Capitein thought slavery would come to an end and that he identified with the inclusive rather than the exclusive aspect of Calvinist theology. He identified with the inclusive strain of Calvinist theology, not the exclusive strain. That strain, that strand, the inclusive strand of Calvinist theology leaned, and I would argue continues to lean, toward Pentecost rather than Babel. In fact, Call of the Gentiles leaned so heavily toward the inclusive strand of Calvinist theology that many branded it an abolitionist work at the time. That's a work of abolition. He's calling for the abolition of slavery. So he got branded, labeled an abolitionist. Following his training at the Latin school, Capitein entered the University of Leiden, which you can see illustrated here. At the University of Leiden, Capitein, I argue, would continue to lean toward the more inclusive strand of Calvinist theology. Admitted in 1737 to study theology, the cost of his studies were paid for by his guardian, Jacobus von Hoch, and the Hallett Fund, which promoted the study of theology and prepared young men for the ministry. Now, most continental scholars viewed Leiden as the greatest university in Europe at the time, as well as the most prestigious center for classical studies. More prestigious than Cambridge, more prestigious than Oxford, Leiden was viewed as the best university in Europe, and Kapitein begins his studies there in 1737 to study theology. Now, that reputation was due in part to the fact that educational funds at Leiden were spent on professors' salaries. Wouldn't that be nice? As a result, Leiden attracted many leading progressive scholars from France and Germany. If you were a leading progressive scholar, you wanted a job at Leiden. You're going to get a good salary. In addition, the professors of the Faculty of Theology were some of the most renowned in Europe. And those would be Kapitein's professors. They were some of the most renowned Faculty of Theology professors. Under the leadership of the preeminent missionary theologian Johannes Cocceius on the left there, the preeminent missionary theologian in Europe at the time, Johannes Cocceius. Under his leadership, the faculty, quote, acquired a spirit of tolerance and renewal as opposed to the unbending dogmatic position of Gisbertus Futius and his followers at the University of Utrecht, the exclusive strand of theology. And that's Futius on the right. He was at the University of Utrecht, not Kapitein's professor, nor a leader at Leiden, but Cocceius. Under his leadership, the Faculty of Theology at Leiden acquired a spirit of tolerance and renewal. In fact, Cocceius had a profound impact on Kapitein's mentor, Hendrik Velse. Cocceius impacted Velse's views, Kapitein's mentor. And Cocceius had a profound impact on 4 well-known professors among the faculty at the University of Leiden. On the left, Taco Hajo van den Honert, a lecturer in the New Testament on homiletics. And on the right, his son, Johannes, a lecturer in church history and oratory, were both of them were advocates of Cocceian theology at the University of Leiden. And it was the man on the right, Johannes van den Honert, who chaired Kapitein's dissertation. He was the chair of the dissertation committee for Kapitein. And he may well be the one who suggested the subject of his dissertation. Chairs of dissertation committees often do that. They will suggest, here's an idea that needs exploring. You should explore it. So it's likely Johannes suggested the subject of Kapitein's dissertation. Now, you're probably not going to be able to see it. I can see it because I'm close up. Maybe you'll reach it, but look behind Kapitein. That's an illustration of Kapitein, a portrait of Kapitein. The influence of Cocceius and Taco van den Honert is reflected in one of the most well-known portraits of Kapitein from the period. The portrait, as you can see, shows Kapitein sitting in front of a bookcase containing works by Cocceius and van den Honert. That's the person creating that portrait. That's deliberate, showing the influence of what influenced Kapitein's thought. Cocceius and Van den Honite. Their books are in the bookshelf in the back. Now, it is in this social cultural context that Capeltine delivered his dissertation as a formal lecture before the professorate at Leiden on March 10, 1742. The lecture represented the culmination of his studies at the University of Leiden. And the subject of his dissertation, for those who can't read Latin, there's the title. The subject of his dissertation was whether slavery was compatible with Christian freedom. In the end, you want to know the thesis, here it is. In the end, he concluded his thesis was that physical slavery was compatible with Christian freedom. But hold on, the thesis isn't done. There's one more point, which is a spiritual freedom. Christian freedom is a spiritual freedom. So he concludes physical slavery was compatible with Christian freedom, which is a spiritual freedom. And at that point, you might be thinking, so he is supporting slavery. Well, hold on. What did that mean? This meant that a converted slave certainly becomes spiritually free. But does, and I put this in italics, but does not necessarily become physically free, because they still live within the bounds we're going to pick that up again because you see what he's doing there. He's doing, if A is true, then B is true, then C is true. So a close reading of the thesis. This meant that a converted slave certainly becomes spiritually free, but does, italics, not necessarily, to me, that is key that he puts that in there, not necessarily become physically free. Why? Because, now listen to his because they still live within the bounds of earthly laws and kingdoms. Now that thesis on its surface echoes the theology of moderate Calvinists like Cocceius and Van den Honite. That's a moderate position. One would not call that for the time radical or an abolitionist on its surface. We would say, well, that's a moderate view. But listen, there is an important context here, isn't it? What does Capeltine want out of the dissertation? What does he need out of this dissertation? There's three things he needs, actually, and wants. That thesis, that moderate thesis, meant there would be one, little trouble securing approval from the members of the West India Company who would pay his salary, right? And he needs their support. If he's going to get paid, they're the ones that pay his salary. If he's going to be ordained and become a missionary and a pastor, they pay his salary overseas. Two, he needs to secure the approval of the Classis of Amsterdam, because they're the ones who would ordain him. And they're not going to ordain an abolitionist or a radical. And finally, an appointment as a Dutch Reformed missionary to the Africans living in and around Elmina. Those are the three things, right? And that dissertation, you would have little trouble securing those three. In fact, on May 7, 1742, Capeltine becomes the first African to receive ordination in any Protestant denomination in Europe. In short, the dissertation was a success. It paved the way for Capetine's ordination and his appointment as a missionary in Elmina. The Dutch translation, so as you can see, there's the Latin work, right? He presents it in Latin, as you would as a theology doctoral candidate. But then look, it gets published in Dutch. And there it is. The Dutch translation of the dissertation went through 4 editions in the very first year. That tells you something if something's going through 4 editions in the very first year. And those editions eventually included laudatio, or celebrations, that included more than 10 praise poems by theologians. Yet, even the celebrations, even these laudatio, echoed the biological racism of the age. Show you. For the foreword of the book, of the dissertation which was published, Brandijn Grijssen, a fellow student Capetine met while studying at Leiden, wrote a poem that accompanied the portrait of Capetine in the book. So this is from the book, one of the pages. It's a portrait of Capetine. It's the one we saw earlier. But now notice, below the portrait is a poem written by Brandijn Grijssen, a fellow student of Capetine's while they're at the University of Leiden. And here's the translation of the poem. I thought about reading it in Dutch, but because of time, I'm just going to read the English translation. Beholder. So it's down here if you want to read along in the Dutch. Beholder, see this Moor. His skin is black, but white his soul. Since Jesus as priest prayed for him. He is going to teach faith, hope, and love to the Africans, that they, whitened, may always honor the Lamb with him. End quote. Now, in the preface of the dissertation, Capetine informed readers that he was aware that some Christians, quote, feared that through evangelistic freedom, slavery would disappear from those colonies which Christians own, to the great detriment of the overseers of those colonies, end quote. He also acknowledged that most people thought Christianity and slavery were contradictory. Pro-slavery advocates, including members of the West India Company and the Dutch Reformed Church, were concerned that if Africans were converted slaves, they would automatically be freed. That was a fear. Consequently, they did not support the practice of sending missionaries to West Africa or the Americas. As a result, Capetine needed to convince them to send missionaries like himself to Africa. Anti-slavery advocates, on the other hand, they believed that the new covenant of Christ was as much physical as spiritual, meaning that converted slaves ought to receive both spiritual and physical freedom. But of course, he couldn't say that out loud in his dissertation if he wanted to achieve his aims. But here he is in the preface acknowledging that context. He acknowledges that context in the preface. In the first chapter, Capetine defined slavery and presented his topic. Now, here's his definition of slavery. He defined slavery, quote, as a status in which someone is unwillingly subjected to the authority of another, end quote. Now, that definition he grounded in the work of contemporary jurists like Hugo de Groot and his classical education in The Hague. As for his definition of Christian freedom, Kapitein grounded that in John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. And according to John Calvin, Christian freedom was freedom from the law of Moses and sin. Having established a working definition of slavery and Christian freedom, Kapitein explored the ancient origins of slavery in chapter 2. By doing that, Kapitein showed that nearly all societies had made use of slavery in some form or another. To prove his point, Kapitein referenced Leviticus 25 to show that the Jews owned slaves, just like the Romans. And as he did in Call of the Gentiles, now remember, we're now into chapter 2. One wonders how carefully did readers read? Well, I'll get to that point in a moment. As he had done in Call of the Gentiles, Kapitein in chapter 2 once again asserted that slavery was not natural. According to Kapitein, nature made all people free. And it was the laws of nations that made people slaves. Important point. To make that point, Kapitein cited Genesis 9, verse 25. He cited a number of classical authors, and he cited the Latin poet and bishop Alcimus Avitus, who argued that slavery was part of the fall. And therefore, slavery was a curse. It was not a blessing. Kapitein also cited the law of Moses in the biblical book of Exodus, which stated that if a Jewish master broke the limbs of a slave, the slave was to immediately be freed. By making that statement in his dissertation, Kapitein, I would argue, is clearly not defending slavery and is clearly not defending chattel slavery, which was well known, by the way, by that time, that in Suriname, the Dutch colony, there were masters doing those sorts of things. So I would argue he is clearly not defending chattel slavery that was being practiced in Dutch colonies overseas. In chapter 3, Kapitein set out to prove that slavery and Christianity were not contradictory. According to Kapitein, the freedom of the new covenant ushered in by Christ is not simultaneously spiritual and bodily. And to support that point, Kapitein relied entirely on biblical evidence. All of the evidence he shows, it's a long list, is from the New Testament. In each of those texts that he references, either use the word slave or freedom, or phrases such as the yoke of slavery or slaves of men. Kapitein equated the word slavery and the phrase yoke of slavery with the outer observance of the law of Moses, whereas freedom he defined as freedom from sin. Kapitein also maintained that Paul's admonition to the members of the house churches in Corinth, that since they were, quote, bought with a price, they should not become slaves of men, supported the cause of spreading the gospel among the Gentiles overseas rather than our adversaries' cause, because the Corinthian Christians were debating whether slavery could coexist with Christian freedom. They were having the same debate. Capitine then highlighted 1 Corinthians 7, verse 21, Paul's letter to that church that's debating whether slavery could coexist with Christian freedom. He highlights the moment in the letter where Paul concluded that a slave who accepts Christ should be content in that condition. However, there's a however, if a slave can become free by honorable means, Paul thought a slave should attain their freedom, for that is preferred to slavery. Capitine also marshaled evidence. We knew this was coming from Philemon, just like other theologians had done before him. Capitine emphasized the fact that Paul sent Onesimus back to his owner after instructing him in the basics of Christianity. Onesimus, if you're familiar with Philemon, Onesimus was enslaved by Philemon. Onesimus had run away and ended up meeting Paul, and then Paul instructed him in the Christian faith. And then Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon. Now, by the way, in that culture, Onesimus would fear for his life because his owner could kill him for running away. Yet Paul sends Onesimus back and then writes to Philemon. Now, Capitine emphasized that Paul sent Onesimus back to his owner after instructing him in the basics of Christianity. But Capitine also points out that Paul encouraged Philemon to take Onesimus back out of brotherly love on account of their shared faith, rather than subject him to corporal punishment, which is what the law stated. Onesimus should be corporally punished by Philemon. And Paul said, no, don't punish him for running away. Once again, you see Capitine defending both the right to mission and the rights of the enslaved there. So Capitine, over and over again in his dissertation, I argue, he's qualifying his conclusion. And again, keep that context in mind of the aims, the goals he wants to achieve. So it's a conclusion that might on the surface seem to support slavery, but it is qualified. And I would argue is challenging enslavement as it existed in the terms of chattel slavery in the Dutch colonies. He's challenging it. Capitine in the dissertation also called attention to the fact that the virtues of charity and love ought to encourage Christians to free their slaves. And it is those virtues, remember this infamous image of Josiah. Those virtues, the Christian virtues of charity and love, Capitine argued, ought to restrain Christian enslavers from that, from abusing the people they claimed as property. Since over 75% of the Africans enslaved and transported by the Dutch ended up in that colony, the colony of Suriname, or Spanish colonies in the Americas, such a statement would demand nothing short of substantial reform. Enslaved Africans suffered under notoriously brutal conditions in those colonies. Capitine concluded his dissertation by reasserting his thesis. Slavery, he declared, does not contradict Christian freedom, and so does not impede the spreading of the gospel in those Christian colonies where it prevails right up to this day. That was a quote from the dissertation. Then, so now we're in his conclusion, but there's a then he adds to that. Then he cited Ephesians 6, verse 9. Now, by the way, notice, and this is what you would do, of course, in that period, still many, he's citing biblical evidence to prove his point, right? So those are great places for him to make his qualified statements, like you're going to argue with the Bible. Then he cited Ephesians 6, verse 9, and he admonished, quote, Christian gentlemen. Well, that's a loaded term. The Christian gentlemen who know who they were. He admonished Christian gentlemen to treat their slaves, quote, with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart as to Christ, end quote, and not to threaten them, because God is just and partial to the slaves as to Christian gentlemen. He's just as partial to the enslaved as he is to you, Christian gentlemen. Don't forget that. Now, the fact that Capetine's dissertation was immediately published after his defense and went through 4 editions in the very first year suggests that it achieved a wide audience beyond his academic peers. Now, having read what the contemporaries thought about it, right, those praise poems, what gets written about the dissertation after it's published by those who read it, what we discover is that the majority of those who read the Dutch translation read what they wanted to read. Here they thought was a defense of slavery, written by a former African slave, now ordained as a pastor in the Dutch Reformed Church. Not surprisingly, Dutch Calvinist investors, pastors, planters, and traders heaped praise upon it. It justified their service of both God and mammon. Now, I would argue more careful readers noticed that Capetine's argument invited the Dutch to take a step toward abolition of slavery by affirming a genuinely inclusive Christian community. That was Capetine's vision, a genuine inclusive Christian community in which all people are welcome and all people are treated with equity and kindness and respect. That's the vision. I know I'm going a bit over, but I decided to present some analysis of the dissertation. And now here's the ending. After working as a missionary in Elmina for over 2 years, so Capetine was ordained and then sent as a missionary to Elmina. So he's back in Elmina, where he, remember, had served as an enslaved boy in that very fort, Elmina, which I had described what the purpose of that fort was. After working as a missionary in Elmina for over 2 years, Capetine finally received a letter from the members of the Classis of Amsterdam on May 21, 1746. Now, for those you're not familiar with the workings of the Dutch Reformed Church, that Classis, the Classis of Amsterdam, was the regional assembly for local church boards of the Dutch Reformed Church in the region around Amsterdam. church boards in Dutch colonial communities and territories overseas, like Elmina, also fell under the jurisdiction of the Classis of Amsterdam. So now, 2 years having worked as a missionary in Elmina, 2 years later, Kapitein gets his first letter from the Classis of Amsterdam. And of course, he's been reporting on his progress. That's part of the expectation. As a missionary, you have to report back to the Classis. So he's been reporting on how it's going. So 2 years later, after he's been sending out reports, he gets a letter from the Classis of Amsterdam. Rather than encourage Kapitein for his initial success in establishing a school for the children of the local Fante people living in Elmina, or praise Kapitein for his translations of the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed into Fante, a local dialect of the Akan languages. Rather than doing that, the members of the Classis of Amsterdam chastised Kapitein in the letter. Now, we know he had done all those things from his reports, but rather than encourage him, praise him for all those things that he had done in those 2 years, the members of the Classis in their letter chastise him. Why? Rumor had it that Kapitein had fallen in love with a young Gentile negress and wanted to marry her. The Classis members disapproved of the marriage because the woman was not a Christian. Therefore, a white Dutch Christian woman named Antonia Grendeldos was being sent to Elmina on a West India Company ship for Kapitein to marry. The Classis members were also particularly bothered by Kapitein's translation of the Lord's Prayer. Instead of the orthodox, "Our Father who art in heaven," the opening line of Kapitein's translation read, "Father of us all who art in heaven." I submit the Classis members should not have been surprised. That translation would not have surprised more careful readers of Kapitein's dissertation or the Call of the Gentiles. It reflected the underlying thrust of Kapitein's argument and vision. He was deftly, I argue, deftly calling his white Dutch compatriots to take a step toward abolition of slavery by affirming a vision of a genuinely inclusive Christian community in which all are welcome and treated with equity, kindness, and respect. A vision white Dutch American Calvinists like myself need to hear and put into practice. Thank you. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. I have a question.
Yeah, again, I apologize for going over time.
I hope you
today,
can
but-
stay an extra 5 minutes.
Sure,
because-
yeah, I'm
okay.
happy to, yeah.
Okay, a question I have is, were the people unaware of Paul's, in one of Paul's letters, he urges people who are Christian to marry people who are not Christian and strive to convert them, that this would increase the kingdom of God. And did this carry any weight?
To Kapitein, it did. That's the argument he makes back, right? He makes that argument, right? In fact, scholars believe, based on the context of Kapitein's writings, that this young negress woman happened to be the daughter of the leader of the people in the Elmina village. Modern historians might call it chieftain. So to Kapitein, I've fallen in love. I'm teaching, right? I've established a school for children. My hope is that, right, she will become a Christian and I'm in love with her, and makes that same point.
Yeah,
Like,
family will grow.
yeah, why would you send me a white Dutch Calvinist on a ship for me to marry?
And
I'm
did this
living
woman give her acceptance of this kind of offer?
apparently.
It sounds like human trafficking.
Yeah, yeah. We don't, and regrettably, as far as I know, we know nothing from her point of view, or don't have anything left behind from her or her thoughts on.
Coming.
What was the end of the story? Did he marry the white Dutch gal?
So that's the challenge with Kapitein once he's in Africa, where we become limited to his reports, but his letters back, and then letters sent to him. For a long time, the thought was that, because once when he sends his last letter to the classes in the West India Company, now he's lost. And so for the longest time, the thought was, we lose him. And then that allows historians to speculate what may have happened. Some scholars have argued that he gives up and goes back into the interior of Africa and gives up as a missionary in Elmina and then dies unknown. Others say he remained, ended up marrying the Dutch woman that was sent, and then dies unexpectedly in Elmina. So there's different speculation around what happens in the end of his life, because we're limited by the sources that exist to tell us.
Could you go back to your notes? I didn't get it quite clear.
Yeah.
When you're talking about John Calvin's his definition of a Christian freedom, it was freedom from the law of Moses and then freedom from
sin. Yeah, and that was a section I took out. I have a whole section on Calvin's theology that influenced Kapitein, and Calvin's views on slavery, which they're few and far between, but you get in his theology, you can see connections between some of what Kapitein's using in his dissertation, and also, again, the influence of his professor van den Honnaert and the other professors influenced by Cocceius. You see that reflected in there. You can see Calvin showing up. In fact, he references Calvin at certain points. So I did do research to find, what does Calvin have to say about slavery? So that was a section I had to take out, because I have a pretty lengthy section there.
Maybe we could get you back for another session on that part.
Yeah.
Maybe in summer or fall.
I also had to, I regretted having to do this too. There's also a lengthy section where I go into a lot of the context of the time, of how the arguments being made by jurists and theologians about slavery at the very time Kapitein's working and presenting his dissertation. So I presented on a spectrum of Calvinists thinking about slavery at the time, which is quite a diverse spectrum. They were few and far between, but there were two prominent, because they published, two prominent Calvinist theologians, pastors, who were very much in the anti-slavery camp and said that what we're doing, engaging in chattel slavery, is a sin. But I characterize them as crying out in a wilderness, because they're very few and far between. You have a large group who I would classify as the moderate Calvinists. And then, so they're in the middle. They're not, I said that wrong. They're not the largest group, but they're more sizable than the anti-slavery group. The largest group is the pro-slavery group at the time. They're the largest group. There's a pastor, Scholtens, who publishes a work in defense of slavery. A lot of that pro-slavery at the time, and why, of course, Kapitein needed to address it, was they're relying on the curse of Ham as the now defense for slavery. That's the large argument being made by many Calvinists at the time that supports the enslavement of people. So obviously he needed to address that in there. And I think he definitely addresses it to say, you're misinterpreting that text.
I can see where Calvin was probably echoing Paul and saying that Christian freedom is freedom from the law of Moses. And it's curious to me that there's an effort among some states in our nation to impose the 10 commandments as something should be posted in all classrooms and that sort of thing. And I'm wondering why the emphasis so much on the 10 commandments. And if you're wanting to uphold Christianity, I would think the Lord's Prayer might be more acceptable, or the Sermon on the Mount.
Mhm.
And is it to get a broader coalition so that Jewish people will support that as well? This is speculating into current times. If you have a comment on that.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of this, and that was why I wanted to make sure to mention this. These two of the leading theologians in the Dutch Republic at the time, representing two very different ways of thinking about Calvinist theology, one at Utrecht and one at Leiden. Again, Leiden, the more preeminent. At the time, even contemporaries would say Leiden was more progressive, if we want to use that word on it, to Photius, who was also a Calvinist theologian, but much more unbending and rigid in the way he interpreted the Bible. And then I use, right, these terms, Photius more supporting a more exclusive strand of thinking about Christianity, and Kokius more supporting that more inclusive view, which I argue then, right, that's the school he goes to. And so, yeah, so hopefully that addresses that. There's something to say, I think, about that, in that, again, most historians, when they write about Kapitein, again, echo what most contemporaries read in the dissertation, that he's clearly defending slavery. Again, the way, when I read it and then look at the context, look at his call of Gentiles, I give Kapitein more credit to that. Many say he's brainwashed. Right? I give Kapitein more agency. I want to give him more agency than that in his life experiences, even as a boy of 10 years old in that fort at Elmina, and what he observed going on there. He himself being enslaved and his parents most likely killed in a raid, and he's now taking up, he becomes part of this transit slave trade. I don't doubt that he converted to Christianity, but what I see in Kapitein is a someone growing up and searching for, within this new society I live in, how can I, right, bring my agency to bear, my views to bear, still attaining my goals, but still calling the society in which I'm growing up to a level of account. That's why I see him much more, I see him qualifying in there in that dissertation over and over and over again, right? So you can very easily on the surface read it as a defense of slavery. But I, again, unlike many contemporary historians, I give him more agency than that. And to me, that says something about contemporary historians, that they want to read it that way too, and not give him that agency, right? Part of my argument about when you do history is give the people you're studying some agency in the work. And again, I see that in the call of the Gentiles in particular. When I discovered that, and that contemporaries, he's an abolitionist, right? And now going on to get a dissertation and wanting to ordain, and his goal, ultimate goal, it comes out clearly, right? Elsa finds out he wants to be a missionary to West Africa. That's what I want, right? He wants to go home. To me, that says a lot about his agency. He doesn't want to stay in the Dutch Republic. He wants to go home, right?
Brilliant strategist. Brilliant strategist.
That's why I see him very deft. I read him that way. And yeah, so I mean, that comes out as an ethno-historian. That's part of our training, is to see peoples who are oppressed. It's easy to view them as victims, and rather than see them as survivors and agents, right? Resisting in ways that they can't resist. That's how I read Kapitein and see Kapitein when I think about him.
Very interesting. Two things. When Kapitein first sets his foot on Dutch soil at home, he's free.
Mhm.
He doesn't need his freedom, but maybe he needs his freedom by another method if he goes back to Elmina. If he were to return to the place of his birth, he might slip back into slavery, but the only way out of that is to be an ordained missionary of the Dutch Reformed Church. Bingo. Because
Exactly.
you say, what does he really need as he writes this dissertation? Well, he also needs academic credibility, which he certainly
Oh.
does achieve, as you've described how he manages his
Yeah.
sources and how he discusses them.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because that is key, right? Because that was a very real danger, right? If he hadn't been, he could get caught up in the slave trade again. But that also reminds me of something else, which many contemporary historians will cite, which again, there are contemporary historians who argue he really didn't, how do I put this? Did he really complete and earn a doctorate? And right, they questioned that, whether that indeed happened, even though you see the Latin version got published, that it got published in Dutch. So there's even this questioning that some contemporary historians make about whether he really earned that doctorate or not. But when you explore enough into his background and all the training he received, again, more agency there.
Why would you automatically assume that someone who's Black doesn't have linguistic aptitude to acquire 3 or 4 languages if he starts when he's 14 years old and he has all these brilliant teachers
Yeah.
and everything?
Exactly.
So it's just such a knee-jerk reaction
Mhm.
for the academics when they're dealing with the clergyman to say, what's his self-serving motivation? What's the downside of this? Or anyone
Mhm.
who on the mission field is converted. That's a Rice Christian. They got something
Yeah.
out of it. They had a motive. They never give agency or credibility to the person who comes into the faith. Ever. I mean, they don't even stay neutral, but they don't even notice this.
Yeah.
It's a common habit. I wonder, what is the Dutch word for slave?
Oh, well, slavery is called slavernij. That's a good question.
Because I saw in the Latin, it's related to our word servitude.
Yeah,
So it also is related to servant. But when people translate the Bible then in 1611, every time they hit that word, which they're not hitting in Latin because they're not using the Latin Bible.
Yeah.
They're using the Hebrew and the Greek. But they're free to say servant. Every time they hit slave, they use servant. If they do that, the whole translation of the Bible
Yeah.
has screened out slavery a
Mhm.
lot. So it would be really interesting to use a thesaurus on the 1611 Bible.
Mhm.
And every time servant is used, go back and see which
What's
word
the word?
it
Yeah.
was connected to and whether they screened slavery to say servant.
Mhm.
And then in America, then we just turn that into workers. They say workers,
Mhm.
and now you don't have any reference to slavery at
Yeah.
all.
Mhm.
So it would be
That's a good,
really,
yeah.
yeah. And our words do the same thing. I mean, English
Mhm.
does this servitude and servant, and there you go.
Yep. That's a good point. Mhm.
Bill, my husband grew up in Alabama. His family, his mother was a teacher and his dad was a professor, and they had help.
Yes.
At one time, and Bill was raised by a Black woman, in addition to his mother. And at one time, I called this woman a slave, and Bill said, "Oh heavens, don't call her a slave. She was our servant." And
Yeah.
there's sensitivity about words matter.
Mhm.
Are you coming back again one more week?
One more.
Okay, good.
So
We're looking
next
forward
week-
to it.
Next week, we're going to spend the entire time in North America, actually. Because we're coming back to, if you remember from the very first session, that letter from Peter Lowe, we're going to get there. That's where we're headed next week. And I'll show you how all of the 3 things connect to that. So that's where we're headed next week.
So come back next week. One more comment or question quickly?
Just a comment. I went last week to museum in Detroit downtown about Black history in America. And I've forgotten the name of the museum. It's near Wayne State University. It was very interesting, especially the slave ship demonstration.
Yeah.
It was beautiful. I mean, it was beautiful. It was provoking.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.